Hi guys, this is Dr. Sadasivam once again with you today. And in today's session, we're going to talk about some of the rudiments of a very important concept, very important concept called as FMEA, which is failure mode effect analysis. I'm sure those of you who have worked in shop floors, I'm sure you're very familiar about this concept, and I'm also sure that you would have taken up specific projects on this particular concept. And for those of you who have not come across this term, I will try to encapsulate a complete 2-day training program in the next 10 to 15 minutes to just give you an understanding of what we do in our training workshops that concern this particular subject. So what is FMEA? FMEA stands for Failure Mode Effect Analysis. Now, what is FMEA? This is a tool to identify, to quantify, to prioritize and evaluate risks. I'm sure the workplace we work in, they are full of risks here and there. I'm sure we have taken a lot of actions to mitigate those risks as much as possible, but in spite of that, risks always continue to remain because we always traverse uncharted territory and we really don't know when the risks, in what form they will appear. So typically we are going to talk about two important things. What is the goal of FMEA? And then we will also talk about why is that required. Now, if you talk about the goals, it is about what steps can we take in order to reduce risk or failure. The second thing what we will be doing is how do we ensure that these failures that happen once in a way are detectable. And thirdly, we will also be talking in terms of how we can prevent those failures from happening in the first place, right? Prevention is better than cure. So we will be talking about some of the aspects of prevention, some of the aspects of cure also. Why is it required? To answer that question, it is required to keep track of potential failures and some of the countermeasures that needs to be taken in order to avoid risk. Now, in order to do that, if you look at the evolution and concept of FMEA, there is something called as a RPN. RPN stands for Risk Priority Number. So what is this number? Of course, when you come to the training workshop, we will be talking in detail about this concept, and we will also be taking up specific examples from the industry in order to reinforce this concept. But at a broad level, this is nothing but it is a product of the severity, the second is probability of occurrence, and then thirdly, to what extent such risks can be detected. So obviously you have something called as a detection rating, etc., all that we will be talking about. These are some of the components of FMEA. So typically we will be talking about what are some of the potential effects of failure. We will also be talking about what kind of control, checks and balances, mechanisms we can have in the shop floors. And thirdly, the recommended actions, because these actions, I'm sure all of you are taking these actions based on various projects like Six Sigma, etc., because life is too short to commit all mistakes ourselves and then learn from those mistakes. Therefore, it is necessary that we need to learn from the mistakes committed by others, by other organizations, and that is how these case studies are extremely important. And in our training workshops, we bring in a lot of case studies from other organizations so that we will not only learn from our mistakes, but we will also be learning from the mistakes of the other organizations. Now, when do we use FMEA? FMEA, at the cost of repeating it so many times, once again, let me explain that for you. FMEA stands for Failure Mode Effect Analysis. Now, there are three important aspects of it. One is, how do we analyze in terms of whether it's a high risk, low risk, how much low. We're not going to talk in terms of binary concepts in terms of risky or not risky. We will be talking about it from the perspective of a spectrum, say on a scale of 0 to 10, in terms of 10 being the highest risk and 0 being the most risks. We will be taking up each of these risks, and first we will analyze that, and secondly, it is the improvement stage in terms of what actions we have taken and what kind of an impact it can have, especially as far as the outcome is concerned. And then thirdly, we will also be talking about the control aspects in terms of which failure modes are most critical to control, so that those can be included as part of our control plan. So typically we will be talking about three things, which is analyzing, then secondly, how do we improve that, and thirdly, in terms of how those things can be controlled. Now, if you look at this evolution of this Fmea, initially it was used in the NASA. In fact, I wasn't aware of it because when I used to work in Maruti, I've organized lots and lots of training programs for our shop floor engineers, shop floor managers. But during recently, when I was working on this program for Hindustan Petroleum, because Hindustan Petroleum attaches lots and lots of importance on safety, on these kind of shop floor functions. Being in the process industry, they attach too much importance to that. So when I was developing a training program for Hindustan Petroleum, I came to know that the evolution of Fmea was in NASA. Sending rockets, and they have their own research on black holes, whatnot, all these space research. It originated from NASA, and of course it was adopted in the automotive industry later, and then it was incorporated in the quality standards 9000 by big three companies. I'm sure you know what those big three companies are. I'm talking about the automotive companies. Any guesses what those three big companies are, especially as far as automobiles are concerned? I'm not talking about those Price Waterhouse, PwC, Deloitte, and I'm not talking about that. In the automobile, when we talk about big three, we are talking about General Motors, Ford, and Toyota, right? It was incorporated by them in their QS 90, sorry, not 90,000. I think it's QS 9,000. And now, not just in the automotive industry, it's being used across all industries. Process industry, for example, it can be used in glass industry, it can be used in machineries, host of other industries, they can be done. Now, as far as potential applications in the oil and gas industry was concerned, we had taken up this Fmea in the context of refineries, in the context of storage tanks, office atmosphere, offshore installations, pipelines, laboratories, etc., etc. Because Fmea is not something which can be implemented only in the production floor. It can be implemented everywhere. It can be implemented in offices. Wherever there is a potential danger or a risk, this can be used. And not just, a risk to life and limbs. It can also be used for mitigating risks, economic risks, financial risks. This concept can be used, right? In fact, I didn't know how it can be used in financial to mitigate financial risks, because when we did this group activity with Hindustan Petroleum, there were some chartered accountants also who attended this training program, and those guys came and said they presented for 15 minutes in terms of how this concept can be used to mitigate financial risks. I'm so proud to share with you that during the pre-assessment tests, when I had asked a couple of questions to these chartered accountants, they were not aware of this concept of Fmea. And after the training workshop, those chartered accountants came and spoke to me personally and said, wow, what a beautiful concept it was. And then they explained, they presented how they will be using this concept in their own department, finance department, in order to mitigate risks of a financial kind. So that's the beauty of this training program, because it provides lots and lots of insight into what this concept is and how well it can be used. Now, typically before we look at this training program, we normally look at the decomposition of the word problem, right? When you call it a problem, you talk about a danger, you talk about risk, all that, they all can be used interchangeably. So broad level, a problem or anything is a deviation from the expectations. So what could be the reason? It is a result of so many contributing factors, right? So each of these problems, they present an opportunity for improvement, and that is exactly where we will be using this concept and look for improvement. In fact, the Japanese call this as KAIZEN. KAIZEN means continuous improvement. All of us are aware that Japan as a country was completely decimated soon after those bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki way back in the year 1945, and we can see in the last 7 or 8 decades how much this country has come up on the economic scene. Such a small country, you can see it's making great strides in technology, science, automobile, productivity. How? All because of this concept of KAIZEN, which is continuous improvement, and they have been using all these in some way or other. They may not call it, the terminologies could be different from company to company, but when you look at the philosophy of what these concepts are, you will come to know that the philosophy is the same. The basic theory underlying each of these applications are the same, though they can be called in so many other names. Now, especially in the context of how this can be applied in the industry, it can be identified. It can be used to identify some of the failure modes. It can be used to determine the effect and severity. It can identify the causes. It can identify probability of occurrences, what kind of control and effectiveness systems we need to have. And we will also be learning how to quantify priorities. Life, we want to do everything, but all said and done, each of these resources have to be used very, very judicially, and that's where prioritization becomes extremely important. In the context of prioritization, we will be talking about various theories like ABC analysis, PARETO analysis, which typically talks about how 10% of the variables account for 90% of the problem. So it's important for us to identify those 10 people. Typically, it is called as vital few and trivial many, because many of the leaders spend too much time on trivial things without focusing on the main things, and that's exactly where Pareto analysis comes into picture. So we will be taking up Pareto analysis, ABC analysis, this training program, because even here in FMEA, we have something to prioritize. And what is that prioritization? We will be prioritizing the risks. If you have 50 different risks in the company, it's not possible for a few people to focus on all those. Therefore, we will be prioritizing those risks. We will also learn how to develop proper action plans, and then we will also be learning how to document those action plans, what kind of challenges might emerge, what steps we can take to surmount those challenges. All that we will be discussing in this training workshop in full length, right? There are some important terminologies that we need to know. For example, what is a failure mode? What is a failure mode effect? What is severity ranking? What are failure mode causes? Occurrence analysis. And typically when we talk about occurrence analysis, we will also be talking about how we will be rating them, and based on various parameters, how we will be ranking them. And then we will be talking about failure mode control. We will talk about detection rating. We will also be talking about risk priority number. Remember, we talked about risk priority number before the start of this session, where we discussed that it's a product of severity. What is the severity of that risk? And then what is the probability of occurrence? And then whether it is detectable or not detectable. For example, if there is an issue, is it easily identified? Normally, we give this example of the gas cylinder, LPG gas cylinder used in our houses. And detectability, obviously, when the gas leaks, it's a big risk. If you take that particular risk, what happens? How do you know that there is a gas leakage? It smells. Is that smell part of that LPG? Absolutely not. They add that smell for detectability, and that's the way they mitigate the risk. So we always take the example of LPG whenever we do this training workshop on FMEA. So it smells. So once it smells, so for anyone to take action on a risk, detectability is important. That's where this comes into picture. There are a host of other examples, like those of you who work in multi-story, who stay in multi-story apartments, or you work in mall offices. We have this sprinkler system. We have the smoke detection alarm. That's also one kind of detection mechanism. So typically when we talk about risk priority number, we take all these variables into consideration. What is the severity if that risk happens? What is the probability of occurrence that it happens? And finally, we talk about detectable. So I little bit explained this because this is the meat of the whole training program. That was why I focused a little more time on this particular thing. And then last but not the least, it's not just enough people learn these concepts and go back to their office. They need to implement them. If they don't implement, it's like you guys learning how to play football from a book in a classroom. Obviously not. Yes, some aspects of how to play football, what is the area of the ground, what are some of the rules, what are penalties, how are the goals scored, etc. Of course, they are theoretical. We will be talking, but a lot, 80% of the game we learn by playing in the field. Therefore, this is just 20%. You guys have to go back to your production floors. The participants have to implement some of these concepts because ultimately it has to result in an outcome in terms of reduction of accidents or increase of productivity or the reduction of complaints. It has to have a proper business outcome, right? Because that's the philosophy of any operational excellence program, and this is also part of operational excellence program. And then, of course, it has a complete roadmap. Let me explain that. Of course, full explanations will be provided when people attend the training programs. Initially, it starts with how do we describe a process, and then it talks about defining various functions, and then how the identification of various failure modes, and then we will be talking about cause and effects. Effects of failures will be discussed. We will also be talking about what kind of current control mechanisms we have, because every company has some control mechanisms, but the question is not to rock the boat. It's more in terms of what kind of improvements we can bring in the existing system, because your life is a journey, and that's what typically this philosophy of KAIZEN, we talked a lot about Japanese, all that comes into picture. And then once we identify this, then how do we calculate these risks? And then, of course, remember we talked about risk priority number. We will quantify these risks and give them a specific number, and then what kind of action plans we take, all that will form part of this training workshop. And we will also be talking about a very, very important concept, which is called as a Gemba walk, which means Gemba. It's a Japanese word. We will be talking a lot about this philosophy in the training workshop. It talks about that you have to go and see the place, not sitting in the ivory tower in your office and talking to guys over phone what is happening. Go to the spot and see what is happening. Go to the spot, go see, ask questions, why, show respect to people who are there, because main source of information has to come from people on the spot. So these are some of the things we will be doing in a Gemba walk, and we will talk a lot about that. Then we will talk about some of the process descriptions, typically talking about the flow diagram, and then we'll discussing about what kind of past instances have happened. We will talk about customer feedbacks. We will talk about certain critical incidents which had happened in the past, and then assimilation of experience, speaking to people who were involved in those operations, who were part of those events, and then the learning things from them, their first-hand knowledge in terms of what can be done. So we will be learning all this through a very important concept, which is called as a broad framework, which is input, process, output. Very important philosophy. In fact, in my last training session with Ministry of Railways, I typically talked about input, process, and output. And I said, this is one concept which is, in my opinion, I'm telling you guys, the second most effective as far as I'm concerned. The first is invention of potter's wheel, invention of a circle. That's one I'm always dumbfounded. I'm so impressed with that invention. I'm sure all of you are invention of a wheel. And if you ask me specifically, what is your second? My second is the whole concept of input, process, output that regulates everything we do in our life, my dear guys. And then we will also be talking about a SIPOC diagram. SIPOC, S-I-P-O-C diagram. I'm sure the concept is not new. I'm sure you must have learned this concept through various other means, through some other words. But just to give you how important is this Fmea in the context of 5 important people. That is, one is your suppliers, What is the quality of material they are supplying you? Second, the inputs. Third, process. Fourth is output. And then finally, the customer. Then we will also be talking about functional definitions in terms of what kind of functions are taking place. We will be talking about various action verbs and nouns. Why are these required? Because many a time certain words are very, very confusing. One most confusing word in this world, I would say, is boy, please coordinate. Well, what does coordinate mean? So we need to define some of these words, task-related words, fix roles and responsibilities. For example, we will say who will receive, who will deliver, check, calculate, release, test, project, all these words. We will be talking a lot about these words, and we will also see how these words can be used, because ultimately a document needs to be prepared, because for any operational excellence program using these kinds of concepts, it's important that the definitions are very, very clearly laid out, because we cannot afford ambiguities, especially when we work on projects like this. And then we will talk about identifying failure modes, in which, you know, the trainer, me or whoever trainer is handling this workshop, they will explain to you what is does not, what does that mean, too much means what, too little means what, too early, too late, incorrect, unwanted. We will be looking at all these definitions. And then we will also be talking about effects of failure. Like, for example, failures always have some effects, like in terms of how it is going to affect the process, how is it going to affect the end user, what is the immediate and delayed impact. What is the immediate impact? And there could be some impacts which are delayed impacts, which may not show up at this point in time, but it will show up after 3 or 4 months, which will lead to a complaint, and this complaint leads to bad mouthing. It spreads wrong name in the market, and then you will lose your sale maybe after a year. But you wouldn't have a clue what made that, right? Therefore, it's important both in terms of understanding what the immediate impacts are and what the delayed impacts are. We also need to see how we can preempt certain failures happening. It's also important for us to have a long-term view in terms of these kind of failures, and also multiple potential effects of all these. They all need to be studied and investigated. You know, typically that's describing the effects of failure, and we will be talking a lot about all these things. And then finally, determining the causes. There are various tools available for this. We might use an Ishikawa diagram. We might use this same fishbone diagram, cause and effect diagram, possible errors that can lead to a failure. We will also talk about how the existing systems can be analyzed, etc. All that, because there may be various causes for a failure to take place, right? I'm sure most of you are experienced people, and you are aware it's not one single cause for a problem. There can be multiple causes, and we need to factor all of those when we identify potential solutions. And then we have to identify the root cause of these problems through use of various tools, like the one which I explained little time back, Ishikawa diagram or the fishbone diagram, etc. And then we will talk about what our current control mechanisms are. For example, if there is a failure mode, there is a potential cause of that. The potential causes could be anything. Your man could be a reason, your machine could be a reason, material could be a reason, your method could be a reason, right? Potential causes we will identify. We will also talk about what is the current control on that, and then we will investigate in terms of how we can make certain improvements. And then finally, we will talk about how to calculate risks. Remember, we talked a lot about RPN, which is risk priority number, in terms of severity of the effect, and then the probability of occurrence. And then we will also be talking about the detection capabilities. We've explained that enough, and we will be taking up specific examples, and then we will be talking about, for example, if there is a process change, if this process change does not happen, then what could be the severity of that? What is the frequency of that happening? How can we detect that it can take place? For example, it can be any simple example, but I would like to give you a very, very small example, which I recently read in some journal, and that was a beautiful example. Quickly, in Japan, what happened was a customer came to the shore and said, this is a soap box, this is a soap. The cover is available, but there was no soap inside. But as it often happens, no questions asked. Immediately that guy gave a soap to that, replaced that soap to that guy and said, we are extremely sorry, this mistake has happened. So the customer takes that soap, goes away. He talks good about that particular shop and that particular brand of soap, saying that, yes, I purchased this, but some manufacturing defect. The soap was not there, but they were very considerate to give us the soap. He spreads that good word around the colony. But that's not all. Look at this. This guy informs the company. The company immediately calls for a quick meeting. The director of sales makes everybody sits and says, how did this problem happen? The production director was called, how can these mistakes, how did it escape the quality check, etc., etc. Then the devised team of engineers came, they put up machines, they put up some scanners, they made one person to stand there, 3 shifts, a guy was put on the job just to ensure that each soap is inspected. I'm talking about those days of non-automation, maybe many years ago. Today, you might think that it's a very trivial case. Talking about long time back, when they did that, there was a guy working in the shop floor who went and asked, what is happening? Who are these guys? They are consultants from various companies. Maybe we don't know Arthur Anderson, your McKinsey's Putani. We have hundreds of such consulting companies where big guys come there. They make charts, reports, etc., etc. And some kind of a scanner, some guy to inspect that on 3 shifts, just to ensure that complaints of those sorts are not repeated in future. But you will be surprised at what happened. A worker on the production floor comes and says, why all this? At the point where the soap comes out, just put a big blower there. And his thing was very commonsensical. He says, the weight of that soap is say 50 grams, and the weight of that cover is say 3 grams. You don't have to put up these advanced machineries. You don't have to waste your manpower. Put a full speed fan, let the fan run. And any soap which does not have a soap inside, the fan will throw that paper out, Okay. Technology has advanced a lot. That's not what I'm trying to tell you. Today we have automations. We have soap factories where 5,000 soaps are done in a fraction of a second. But we are talking about those days. Typically, what I'm pointing out is, guys, innovation, this ideation. The guy on the shop floor said, such a simple thing. We are talking about 40 years back when these automations were not there. Very practical example. And that is exactly where we talked about Gemba. It's not just enough. We make all these big words, risk priority number, risk mitigation, all that will happen. But that's just for understanding the concept. Nothing is as effective as implementing them on the production floor, and then through the use of data, finding out if there has been any process improvement. That's what typically any improvement process, any improvement initiative in the shop floor suggests, and that is exactly, all these things are part of operational excellence, and that's exactly where this FMEA plays a very important role. And therefore, after having done all that in the workshop, we will also learn how to assess the results in terms of how it was before, how it is after, what kind of outcomes have come, etc., etc. The session. Okay, guys, this was a very brief trailer in terms of what we do in a 2-day workshop. We bring in a lot of case studies. We make the participants go through those case studies, and participants themselves will see from their own areas of operations, and each one of them will be given an opportunity to come and present their findings. Initially, as I explained that chartered accountants example, maybe a lot of people are not aware of these concepts, but once they go through this training program, they familiarize themselves with these concepts, look in terms of how these can be implemented in their own work areas, and they will come and present that. And this way, the job of a trainer, whether it is me or anybody else whom I will be deploying on this project, they will be creating a conducive atmosphere in the classroom to encourage sharing of experiences, sharing actual incidents, clarifying their doubts. That's the trainer's job. As it happens, the trainer is not a know-all. Trainer is not a know-all at all, like many trainers these days think themselves to be. But our approach is, we are there to create that platform because we understand it's a senior level audience. Everybody has 20, 25 years of rich experience behind them. So our job is just to declutter some of these concepts, encourage them to come with their own examples in terms of how much they have understood this concept and how well they will be applying these concepts in their workplace is what we will be focusing. Okay, guys, I've tried my level best. This is a 2-day training program. I tried my level best to encapsulate a 2-day training program into a maybe 10-15 minutes presentation. And that's for now, guys. We have put up series of other videos on shop floor trainings. I request you to watch those videos also. Also, please subscribe to this channel and press the bell notification, because once you do that, our team will be putting up lots and lots of videos on various topics. I'm sure if you cannot organize a 2-day workshop, at least go through these concepts. They'll give you a lot of idea in terms of what these concepts are at a very, very broad level. It's not necessary. If you don't have 2 days to attend a workshop, please go through these videos. We have put up so many videos on so many subjects which can help you in your journey to become a well-rounded person. Okay, guys, thank you very much. This is Dr. Sadasivam signing off till we meet again. Bye-bye. Jai Hind.